Allan Advisors, creating aha moments, presents Aha Business Podcasts. We provide opportunities to discover information to help you run your business and guide your decision making. The more you know, the better decisions you make. For more information, log on to allanhirschadvisors.com. I'm your host, Allan Hirsch. My guest today is David Doerrier. He's a virtual facilitator and presenter. He's also an executive coach. So what motivates you, David? Welcome to the show. What motivates you to get up in the morning and go to work?
That's a great question. Right out of the box, Allan.
Well, I believe in the why. So I'm always interested to understand why people get up in the morning and go to work.
Great. Well, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this
My
podcast.
pleasure. My
pleasure. What gets me up in the morning? I love what I do. Like you said, I've been a presentation skills coach for a number of years. I've been a part of training and development for 30 years. That's how I transitioned into presentation skills coaching folks on the stage, and now coaching them virtually. I love working with people, taking them from where they are now and helping them to achieve their presentation goals. Most of the folks that are coming to me have some background in presenting, but are struggling in certain areas. Right now, the big struggle is, how do I engage my audience through this little camera? Whereas in the past, I was able to engage them from the stage and I was fairly successful. Now, having to have that same level of engagement through Zoom, and there are some changes. So what gets me up in the morning, I would say, is just the passion of helping others and helping others be the best presenter that they can be.
So what are the differences? I mean, you brought up the differences between presenting in front of a live audience and Zoom. I mean, what has to change? What does a presenter need to present, and how does he present that works better on Zoom than in person?
Great. Another great question. Many of the same tips and tricks and techniques that you used while you were on the stage, all of those things can be used in the virtual environment. However, you've got to pick everything up several notches. One of the other thing is, and most people will focus on it, and which is true, is the emotional piece. You can't feel your audience. Your audience can't feel you. When you're on a stage, if you're selling a product, for the most part, you'll be able to feel the credibility of the speaker or sense the credibility of the speaker based on the way that they speak and handle themselves. And before the events and question and answer and things like that, you can get a kind of a good gauge of someone when they're in the room with you. But over Zoom, it's certainly a lot harder. The other thing that's harder with Zoom, you don't know what's going on the other side of the camera. For example, you're on the other side of the camera. I have no idea what else is going on around you in your environment that might be a distraction. If we are in a controlled environment, you're in my sales office, you're in my, you are watching me on a stage, I know what's going on in the room. Right. Where here, I don't know. So bottom line, one of the big differences is creating additional engagement, of having a conversation to establish the credibility, establish the foundation of why are we meeting today. I've seen it many times sometimes in networking groups that I've been a part of, sometimes when I'm coaching folks. There was this one gentleman who was a salesperson. He was new to sales. He says, I'm new to sales and I've got this great product. But behind him, he had a bunch of empty boxes and he looked like he was sitting in the middle of a garage. So that's another aspect of the virtual that you don't have live, is now people are not only evaluating me on my speaking skills and the sound quality, the lighting quality, the camera quality, right, and the quality of my voice, but also evaluating me on what's behind me or what's not behind me. So those are some differences, the difference between being on stage and virtual.
So is what's behind me look nice, or is it?
It looks great. It looks good. We talked earlier about the lighting, but that's a whole nother
Right.
issue.
That's a whole nother thing that we've got to straighten out here.
Right.
But
But behind you is clean. It's organized. It's a bunch of books. It looks
well,
like you have some trophies up top. So it looks good. Very professional.
I came out of the publishing business, which is why the stacks of artwork there.
Mhm.
And it just anyway, it's something, and I agree. So, what else do you work with in coaching to help your clients overcome some of their, I mean, some of their adverse feelings by not being in the same room with the presentees, present the receivers of the presented material?
Another good question. So what there are a number of with my coaching style, what I ask a lot of questions. I ask a lot of probing questions. My background is also instructional design. And in instructional design, to be a good instructional designer, for me to be able to design training, I have to ask a zillion questions and I have to get to the objective. Why are we creating this training? What purpose, what problem are we solving? And those are the same type of questions that I use for the folks that I'm coaching. I
Right.
need to dig to find what that problem is. And when it comes to creating engagement, I use 8 principles, which are the adult learning principles. The adult learning principles are all about creating engagement. They originated from learning, being in the classroom, but the more that I use them, the more that I teach them, the more that I see that anybody can use them in any type of interaction to create engagement.
So what are the 8 principles of engagement?
Well, am I glad that you asked? Uh, the
Well, this is about trying to educate some of my listeners
Okay,
that want to understand how to present.
okay. Well, I'll focus on a couple of them. There are 8: principle of primacy and recency, ownership, principle of effect, principle of relevance, and the 4 additional: readiness, complexity, impact, and repetition. I have my cheat sheet right here.
That's fine.
So let's talk about one of them, the principle of complexity. Many times, and I'll give some examples or give a example or an example in a training situation. Have you ever been to a training class or listened to a speaker who immediately would give very complex instructions or very complex examples, or start talking over your head or other listeners' heads? Have you ever experienced that?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So
More
this would
so on webinars than on just informational, even PowerPoint presentations, but webinars, yes.
Right. So this is an example of where the principle of complexity can be used. Now, in this case, principle of complexity, what I would like you to do is to visualize a swimming pool. On one end of
Okay.
the pool, you have the shallow end, and on the other end of the pool, you have the deep end. So using that as an example, that as a trainer, as a speaker, as a presenter, that you should start from the shallow end of the pool. Simple instructions, simple analogies, simple stories, simple relatable stories. Relation or relates principle of relation. Principle of relevance is also one of the principles as well, one of the 8 principles. So starting off simple, starting off easy, giving easy examples, easy instructions, and as you go through the training, the presentation, you gradually make things more difficult. So that's one example of one of the 8 principles of engagement.
Okay. So give me an example of another. I mean, when you're trying to you really want to simplify what you're doing,
Mhm.
and then get to the more complicated. But I don't know whether you want to get to the most complicated when then you're speaking over the heads of most of your audience.
Right. So here you're getting into the principle of relevance. You have to know who your audience is. And if your audience only needs this much information to be productive, let's say again in a training situation, if all my audience needs to know are these 3 steps, and I start giving them all this other information, then like you were describing, where I was starting to get too complex, or the speaker was getting too complex. This comes to the principle of relevance. Who's your audience? Why is this audience in front of you? What is their current level of understanding? And there are several ways that you can figure that out.
So how do you figure that out?
Excellent question, sir. Well, you can do a poll before the speaking engagement. You could have a poll that asks the type of questions where you can gauge what their current understanding is. How long have you worked with this software? What is your proficiency level with the software? Give me some examples. Answer this question here of it's an open-ended question of some sort to get their understanding of how they understand the principles of this process, for example. So there can be some sort of a poll beforehand. Now, on the day of the event, if I don't know this, on the day of the event, I can ask, how many people here have a roof? If I'm a roofer, how many people here have a roof?
I hope most people answer they have one.
Exactly. So in this situation here, I know that I'm talking to a group of people that all have a roof of some sort.
Right.
Whereas if I asked another question and nobody raised their hand, now I need to massage my presentation in a way that's going to be able to talk to the level that's in the room.
So what is one of the other, you did two. What's one of the third one that becomes very important for a presenter?
Well, we've talked about two of them. We've talked about the principle of relevance, and we've also talked about the principle of complexity. And what I hope I was able to just demonstrate is another one, the principle of repetition. That to get your message to stick in your audience's head, not only do you need to incorporate these 8 principles, one of them is the principle of repetition. If it's appropriate, finding times where you can review. So, Allan, we've talked about 2 of the principles. What was one of the principles that I talked about earlier?
Relevance.
Relevance, exactly. And we also talked about the principle of complexity. So there's an example of how I can incorporate you, the audience, into that review or into that transition. Now that we've talked about the principle of complexity, we've talked about the principle of relevance. Now let's move on to another one, the principle of repetition, and demonstrating that. So finding ways of reviewing what we've covered. This is extremely important in training. I get this a lot of times from new trainers. They'll say, wow, the stuff that I'm teaching is so complex. Well, what I recommend is, let's say that there are 10 processes or 10 steps to accomplish this task. Break it down into small chunks. Let's talk about step number 1, step number 2, step number 3. And now let's review those 3 steps before we move on to the next, helping to cement that information.
Well, it's interesting. Most experts, when we were in publishing, we did a lot of home repair and that kind of thing. They'll skip 2 or 3 steps because it's all in their minds.
Okay.
And they've got to remember that when they're presenting, they got to simplify it. They got to make sure there is every step that is relevant.
Right.
Which is what you're talking about, relevancy.
Exactly.
Is relevant to the process.
Right.
Because so we ended up having professional writers write those books because they would get the steps right.
Right.
We did dry runs with plumbers trying to do toilet repair and water repair, and they couldn't do it.
Right. So what you're describing is something that I'm living with on this computer that's behind me. Not only is it used as a prop, but it's also used for me to do my instructional design. And one of the projects that I'm currently working on is exactly what you described. A subject matter expert has written a manual on how to use this piece of software. Now, this subject matter expert is loaded with information about that product. They're married to the product. So the way that you described it, they skip a couple of steps. Same thing here in this manual. there's a bunch of steps missing. Oh, yeah. I didn't talk about it because, because in their mind, they know it already, but they're not paying attention to who's the learner,
Right.
who are you talking to, who's the lowest level in the room. And in this case, the lowest level in the room is someone who has no experience. So you have to write the manual for someone who has no experience. The other thing that you brought up is when you bring in these writers, which are great, and you bring in someone like me, which is great. I know nothing about the product, so I'm going to write it so I understand it. So
Right.
I could pick up this manual and teach it.
Yeah. Well, this is a good place to take our break. We have a couple of commercials that we need to run. So when we come back, I will continue our conversation with David Doerrier, a virtual facilitator and presenter. I'm Allan Hirsch of Allan Hirsch Advisors, and this is AHA Business Podcast.
Hi, Rick Dempsey here. As a former Oriole and Series MVP, I know a lot about winning and championship teams. Today, I am happy to tell you about my award-winning web design and internet marketing team, Adventure Web Interactive. For over 2 decades, many of Maryland's most successful firms have chosen Adventure Web as their strategic partner for web design and online marketing. I can tell you from using them personally, their search engine optimization and social media programs have saved their clients tens of thousands over the traditional pay-per-click digital agency. Visit adventurewebinteractive.com and listen to what clients such as Hercules Fence, TriStar Electric, ABC Rental, Rhine Landscaping, Markdown's Office Furniture, and many more highly successful firms have to say. And don't forget to tell them Rick Dempsey sent you.
Strengthen, protect, and preserve your retirement nest egg. Scott Garceau here for the Stephen J. Sless Group, Baltimore's reverse mortgage specialist. Reverse mortgages have evolved to become a viable retirement tool. Enjoy retirement without monthly mortgage payments, improve cash flow, pay off debt, and stretch retirement savings. Stephen and his team can offer strategies to make housing wealth work for you. If you're 62 or older, learn if a reverse mortgage could help. Visit reversebaltimore.com.
An equal housing opportunity lender. This is not a commitment to lend. Stephen J. Sless, NMLS 298581. PRMI NMLS 3094.
Welcome back to the show. My guest is David Doerrier. He's a virtual facilitator and presenter. Welcome back, David. It's good to have you here.
Thank you.
So, these are skills, these presenting skills, and they still are different in the 2 modes that we've talked about, in person and on the web, on Zoom. So what is your ideal client and how do you work with him today versus working with him back in January?
Well, thank you. That's another great question. Back in January, I was face to face with most of my clients. Most of my clients were subject matter experts that are now trainers who understand the subject matter. They have it ingrained in their head, but teaching them the mechanics of how to train. Mm-hmm. Right now, I've been very fortunate because those same trainers now had to transition into virtual. So not only am I helping them with the mechanics, the general foundational facilitation skills, but also incorporating how to ramp all of that up in a virtual situation. So even trainers that were proficient prior to COVID are at times struggling with the change to virtual. So I would say that in this situation, yes, I do miss the face-to-face. I do miss the being up in front of a live audience and feeling the crowd. I miss that like everybody else. However, this pandemic for me has been okay because people are reaching out because they need the skills, how to transfer those skills to online.
So, I mean, that's one of the skills I had to learn. I mean, I did a live talk radio show in a studio every week, and I transitioned into the podcast, and it's a different medium. Mm-hmm. But what's the difference or similarities between facilitating, presenting, and training? Those are three types of people that you work with.
Right. Yeah. Facilitation training, and speaking. Were those the three that you were asking about?
Facilitator, presenter, and trainer.
Well, there in this situation, there's probably more similarities than there are differences. One of the things that I've learned through the years as someone in training and development, when I have used the term facilitator, I think of a trainer or someone leading instruction. However, when I've asked that question to others about facilitator, they'll give me a different response, and that would
Well,
be
yeah,
go ahead.
I have a totally facilitator to me
Go
is
ahead.
facilitating a group of people in a meeting,
Mm-hmm.
which totally different than training.
Yes, and I agree with you. However, many of the same techniques that a facilitator would use in a meeting, a trainer can use in the classroom. And I prefer using the term facilitator because I feel what I'm doing as a trainer, I understand what the objective is, similar to what a facilitator would know or is going to discover what is the objective, and then is going to lead that group however is necessary,
Yeah.
so we can all get to that objective. And that's the same principle that I'm using in the classroom. I want you as participants to discover the problems. I want you to discover the ahas. I want you to problem solve it. Again, similar to what a facilitator is doing, asking those appropriate questions that's going to get the audience to start thinking about how do we work through this. So
Yeah. So, but there still are differences between a presenter, a speaker, and a trainer. And
yes, there definitely are. But again, I would say here's where the similarity. Yes, I'm not disagreeing that there are differences. How someone approaches the audience, if it's a lecture style, if there's engagement, though there certainly are differences. However, each of them to me have the same objective. I want to engage the audience. The more the audience is engaged, the more that they can see, feel, taste, smell what it is that I am describing, the more that they are going to remember not only hopefully the content, but also remember me, and maybe be more apt to take a next step or purchase my product or to remain engaged with me on my Facebook page. So I would say that yes, there are differences, but I believe that all of them have the same objective of wanting to engage the audience so we can get to our objective.
so, I mean, there are more similarities than differences. But what are some of the differences?
I think that the differences would be in the level of engagement. For example, someone giving a keynote speech. I'm not asking you questions. You're not responding to questions. You're not asking questions. You're not going through examples. I'm not putting you into small groups, which I could use all of that if I'm a trainer to help to reinforce the message.
Right.
Whereas if I'm a keynote speaker, it's a lecture. However, so the difference there is that it's the level of engagement. However, as a keynote speaker, I want to be able to present my words in a way that still emotionally puts you in that place, helps you see what it is that I'm seeing, which is still going to get me to that same objective of at the end, you've emotionally been impacted by the message. So did that answer your question?
I think so. I mean, the proof's going to become what the listeners think and how they perceive this.
Mhm.
So, what is your coaching style? You work with business owners. Who are some of the people you work with without using names?
Mhm.
And what's the style that you use? I think you've enumerated some of it, but what is the style that you use?
Okay, great question. So as far as some of the people that I work with moms that want to speak in front of the PTA to executives who want to improve their speaking style. This was pre-COVID and also now. They're their level of engagement with their audience. Managers who want to be able to conduct more effective meetings and incorporate these facilitation skills. A big bulk of my business is working with subject matter experts who now find themselves as trainer in many cases in corporate situations where you have a large training organization, and many of the folks that have been promoted into that training role are subject matter experts. The guy that built the software, who better to train it? So in this case here, my style is, in all cases, my style is to ask a lot of questions. I want you to problem solve it. I'm going to give you some I'm going to give you some examples. I'm going to give you some stories, some analogies, but I want to, as quickly as possible, get you with your hands on it, working through creating something that you're going to have to demonstrate what it is you've learned up to this point.
Yeah, because when you demonstrate something, it has to play out so that the ones in attendance can do it themselves later.
Right. Yeah.
If they're trained, as you say, with too high-powered things, they don't know anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah. I guess the other piece is that what I'm teaching engagement skills. So I have two choices here. Either I demonstrate these skills by giving people an opportunity to be engaged with them, or I just stand up in front of the room and I lecture about engagement skills. Well, you need to do this and you need to do that. You need to do this. But if I don't demonstrate it, it won't sink in.
Well, I can understand. I mean, if you're lecturing and you're lecturing on engagement, you're not engaging the audience.
Exactly. Well, yes and no. Yes. Yeah. Again, if I use the right words, the right examples, and keeping them engaged, maybe a lecture style would work. However, my style is to have you participating and to have you answering questions and problem solving. Yes.
Well, first of all, I do the same thing with my clients. I ask a lot of questions, and they're open-ended questions. They're not, yes, no.
Right.
Do you do this? Yes or no?
Right.
No. What do you do with this?
Yeah.
And it allows them to open up and express what they're doing, how they do it, and then you can reach the conclusion of where they need to improve.
Yeah, that's a great example. That's something else I coach about, and I talk about this probably every time I coach someone is about their questioning techniques. Many times, have you ever been to a training or a webinar where it says, "Any questions? Good, let's move on." So two things are wrong there. Number one, by asking a closed-ended question, and number two, not giving people enough time to respond. In the classroom or on a stage, my advice for any speaker would be at least 5 to 7 seconds. Ask the question. Many times people are a little shy. They're waiting for someone else to respond first, but not giving them any time at all to respond. That's all about credibility.
Right. I mean, if you want people to ask questions, you have to give them the time.
Exactly.
And sometimes there's dead silence.
That's another thing. Let me get to that in just a second. I said 5 to 7 seconds if you're face to face. I would say at least 7 seconds if you're virtual, because now we have the additional complexity of, oh, where's my mouse? Where's the mute button? Oh,
right.
Dear, can't find it. Oh, he's already moved on.
Right.
But the other thing that you just mentioned is getting comfortable with the pause. I early in my career, I've also have done a number of a lot of stage acting in my past in community theater, and being comfortable enough on stage to pause, to listen. That to me was the most frightening thing in the world, because if I pause, I'm going to forget everything, or there's that dead silence, and the pause for you, the speaker, is going to feel 10 times longer than it does for us, the participant in the classroom or on the other side of Zoom.
And Zoom needs to be a little bit more time than in person.
Right.
You expressed it. You've got to be able to reach because people are put on mute when they enter a webinar, a presentation,
Right.
and they got to find their mute button.
Right. Exactly.
To ask questions, and you have to answer the questions as best you can.
Right.
And try to be simple with it.
Yes. Another thing around the questions is in asking questions or asking a question and wanting to get a response through chat. It's a great way to engage your audience. However, there's going to be quite a lag time between the time that you ask the question and some of those first responses start showing up in the chat. So you have to learn how to be comfortable with that kind of that little interim period there. So my suggestion would be to anyone that ask those questions, get them to use the chat. However, make sure you have some sort of fill words or fill here, maybe a little story of some sort that's relevant to the question you just asked while you're waiting for those responses to show up in the chat.
Yeah, well, that's something that Zoom or whatever that becomes something that becomes difficult to manage. That you've got to manage that you didn't have to manage in live presentations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You've got to deal with a chat box that might have 20, 30 questions in it, and you have to without stopping, without anything, you've got to go to the questions, and you got to spot the ones that are relevant first.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Earlier, you asked me some of the differences. What are some of the differences between presenting live and presenting in Zoom? And you just reminded me of another one. Is in Zoom, you've got to get proficient with the equipment. You've got to learn how to do everything with Zoom yourself. Having an assistant is great. If you can have an assistant with you to monitor the chat, to help out with problems that are coming up, with letting people into the room, all of those things, those are great. However, what I would say that all speakers that are using Zoom, you must be proficient with it. How do you easily transition to sharing your PowerPoint? How do you easily transition to allowing someone else to be a co-host or a host? All of those things I know in Zoom, and I used to use WebEx years ago, that in both of these platforms, they have their own little Zoom university. There's
Right.
a lot of free videos that you can view, and so you can learn about all these things. So I would say that another difference would be get proficient with the equipment.
Well, and you don't have to be, well, you do have to be proficient with your laptop in order to present PowerPoint presentations locally, but you also have to be absolutely proficient with Zoom.
Right.
You have to know how to set up breakout rooms.
Exactly.
When you're doing presentations and you want people to meet each other in smaller groups, you've got to be able to divide up the 30, 40, 50 people into whatever number of breakout rooms you need.
Right, right. And then also along with that, understanding how you, the facilitator, can jump from room to room to kind of monitor things.
Yeah.
And since you brought that up about the breakout rooms, one of the other principles that I'll talk about here is the principle of primacy and recency. This is dealing with breakout rooms, with chat, with the poll, and so on. Primacy and recency deals with firsts and lasts, impactful firsts and impactful lasts. So in a breakout room situation, the impactful first would be the introduction of why are we doing this breakout session? What are the objectives of doing this session? How is this going to be run? What are the expectations that once I put you in that breakout room, what are the expectations? Who's in charge? What problem are you solving? Coming up with as much information up front to set up that breakout session, set it up as successfully as possible. And then when folks come out of that breakout room, to have a kind of a recap. What did we just do? Why did we do it? What did you take away from it? That's an example of primacy and recency, that impactful first, which in this case is introduction to the breakout room, and an impactful last is what did we just do?
Right.
Let's talk about the recap.
Well, this has been wonderful. David, I want to thank you very much for being on the podcast this morning or today. Thank you very much for that. How can my listeners reach you?
Through my website, presentyourwaytosuccess.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn. If you plug in Doerrier on LinkedIn, there's only going to be about maybe 3 or 4 people that show up, and I'm related to all of them. So you'll find me mixed in there.
So that's Doerrier, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for being here today. I appreciate it. I'm Allan Hirsch of Allan Hirsch Advisors, your host. To reach me, call 443-977-4500 or visit my website, allanhirschadvisors.com. You can listen to the podcast of past shows wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Allan Hirsch, and this has been AHA Business Podcasts.